Welcome to the Free Equitism Podcast. Today, I sit down with Max Ghenis, the co-founder of Policy Engine. We dive into the world of economic policy, discussing everything from universal basic income to the nuances of tax policies. Max shares his insights on how policymakers can leverage data to optimize public policies and improve societal outcomes. Whether you're a policy wonk or just curious about how policies shape our world, you won't want to miss this in-depth conversation with Max Ghenis. Stay tuned for an enlightening episode. All right, Max, it's a pleasure to have you here. I think you're about the most ideal guest I could have for this podcast because one, the free equitism idea is really about stepping outside of this very traditional, left to right spectrum, which really limits our ability to talk about nuance in economic policy. And I think you've been really good at doing that as well in terms of how you think in terms of concepts. But also, I know when you go back and you look through the history of economic thought, there have been these great works from people like Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Henry George, in the more modern era, like Milton Friedman, Thomas Piketty. Right now, I'm actually reading Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, who he sits more on the economic right or laissez-faire. But all of these individuals are generally trying to conduct their activism through the printed word and sort of trying to win hearts and minds and really explain concepts. One of the most novel forms of that I've seen actually is the economist Bryan Caplan, who has now his graphic novels. But what you're doing in your project takes a very different approach. You do have some writing and you've got some great articles online, but generally you're providing something very different than just a printed word, which is a tool to help policymakers understand the implications of their policy so that they can align their intentions with the actual outcomes that these policies will tend to produce. So why don't we start there, and you can tell us about this project and how it's going and how you got here.
Well, it's great to be here, Clay. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm really excited for this new project you're embarking on after having known you and learned from you for the past several years. So I've been running a project called Policy Engine since 2021. Sort of started before then, different projects we can talk about. But our mission is to compute the impact of public policy for the world. So we build free open source software that simulates the effect of economic policies like taxes, tax credits, and means-tested programs like food stamps. And we do that in the US and the UK. We are growing into other countries, into other policy areas. And really, we're trying to use technology to fill this gap of information that has historically been quite limited to organizations that are within government or specific think tanks. We're trying to democratize that for everyone.
Great. So can you give me kind of a sense of who are the individuals who would want to use Policy Engine, make use of this software, and how has that changed over time?
So we started in the UK in 2021, and there it's been a bit ahead of the US just because we had another year or so there. So it's a range of think tanks, advocacy groups. The government is using it in some instances as well. And also just the public. There have been policy conversations, proposals from maybe not the top political parties that might get immediate feedback from the policy world, but second tier parties that have released policies that someone could just immediately figure out here's what's going on with that as a result. And I think we're sort of just shortening that window from policy ideation to analysis and computational results from it. Same kind of thing in the US. So now there are congressional offices, state legislative offices that use Policy Engine to understand and craft their own policies, think tanks, advocacy groups. One organization slice that exists in the US and we haven't pursued so far in the UK has been organizations that are building their own software tools to help people access and understand benefits and tax credits. So there's a growing area of sort of anti-poverty work that's in the tech space as well. And we serve an API so that people can access that information without building all of the rules for those policies themselves. But really, the core groups are pretty similar across the two countries, the public all the way to top policy analysts.
Can you give us some examples of maybe specific policies that have been analyzed by Policy Engine? And from the point of view of a policymaker, let's just say my elected representative, how are they seeing that dissection and sort of analysis? And what is that going to tell them? And how could they potentially, change the policy in response to that? What are the metrics they're trying to optimize for or can optimize for? And have you actually seen this? Have you seen policymakers iterate where they have some proposal, they get some feedback, tweak it, go back through that cycle and try to achieve an end goal state?
Yeah, well, you live in Portland, Oregon. My mom also lives in Oregon, and I've been thinking about some of the policies going on there. The Oregon rebate was one ballot measure that we built some software to analyze, looking at the poverty effect of this universal transfer that would have come at the expense of a gross receipts tax for larger firms. That didn't pass. So, and we weren't, I wouldn't say the Policy Engine software actually helped craft that policy. It was kind of something they wanted to go in with. Here, where I live in DC, though, we were providing technical support to a council member that was interested in a child tax credit. So DC has long had a very generous earned income tax credit, also some other tax credits, and yet none of them reached the poorest children in DC. So they wanted to have something that was fully refundable, inspired by the 2021 expansion of the federal child tax credit. And in some of the early iterations, there were some questions about how to target that program. So they knew they didn't want to have an earnings requirement, but they also didn't want to make it universal, something closer to the Oregon rebate for kids. So they were using Policy Engine to understand what the effect would be of different targeting, whether that's a cliff or a marginal tax rates or a phase-out schedule, how many people would be facing higher marginal tax rates as a result, how it would affect the cost and the poverty impact, the inequality impact. So that was an iterative process that resulted in the policy passing a few months ago. I think they started using Policy Engine about a year and a half ago for that.
So the kinds of things we're going to see using Policy Engine might be things like what would be the rate of child poverty, right, as that's defined. What are some other metrics that one might look at to determine how optimal a policy is, or whether it should be somehow reconsidered or reworked?
I'd say the biggest ones that our users focus on are the cost or revenue generated, so the budgetary impact of the policy, the poverty impacts, the share of people who come out ahead and behind, so winners and losers, and also effects on income inequality. At the same time, I think, so those are, aside from income inequality, those are used in some other tools that do this kinds of analysis as well. Where we start to depart from the status quo is we have a lot more focus on the individual households. So we build charts where you can enter information about your household or a hypothetical household, and it'll depict how the program affects you depending on your earnings. So there's often you can think of this as a shape of the policy. So one example would be the earned income tax credit. That's one policy that's kind of a trapezoid. So introducing or expanding the EITC is going to increase your net income. If you're sort of linearly, it's going to go up as your earnings increase, and then it plateaus, and then it phases out as your incomes rise. Sometimes you have these cliffs where instead of a slow phase out, you're actually worse off because you earned more. So we provide visualizations at the individual and the societal level of how policy reforms affect the prevalence and severity of cliffs as well. So, for example, we estimate roughly 5% of people across the country face cliffs where they would be worse off if they were to earn more. And that's kind of one of those newer metrics that we hope can align policy with the values that people have.
Yeah, and I know that with the Oregon rebate, I actually checked that out on Policy Engine because I live in Portland, and it had sort of two components, right? One was the gross receipts tax, which I think probably a good majority of economists would not sit well with. But the other side was the universal basic income, which I know you and I are both big fans of. So I was a little torn there, but it did give me better data, and I could actually look at my household and kind of see what the implications would be for us. And I guess at scale that could be used by policymakers if they are trying to win votes, right? I don't know that happened here, but if there had been greater awareness, you can imagine getting a mailer that says this will make your household better off. I know we've talked also about things like a land dividend, right? Where you say, given the shape of inequality, if we instituted some particular tax on, say, land values and then distributed that as a universal fixed sum to everyone, then let's just say everyone below the 70th percentile would be better off. That's a good majority, and you would think a properly informed society would then tend to vote in their own best interest for that policy. Do you see a future where this could be incorporated in sort of how politicians or other leaders make the case for policy and win votes?
Absolutely. I should say we're completely nonpartisan. Policy Engine doesn't take stances on any of the policies that we evaluate. And that's somewhat different from basically every think tank. Many of them are nonpartisan, but they do advocate or at least frame positively or negatively some of the policies that they consider. We're really trying to be a calculator, a tool that's used across the political spectrum just to contribute evidence. And we have seen that a lot of policymakers and folks they're interested in identifying the effects on archetypical households, and they do that through our tool. It's very easy once you design a policy, you can just share a link and anyone can then see what the impact, after filling out some information about themselves, what the impact of their policies are on that household. For the election, we built a calculator specifically so you could enter your information and we would show you the impact of Harris and Trump's core policy platforms, and also alongside it, the broader effect on society. So we're hopeful that, I think everyone has some selfishness and some altruism in their bones, and when they're making choices about who to vote for, or if you're a policymaker, what kind of policies to put forth, they're balancing those, and we want to bring evidence to bear in their decision-making process at both sides of that. What you're saying also ties into a broader area that we're investing a lot more in now, which is behavioral responses, general equilibrium effects. How much do policies not just have an immediate effect because you're transferring money from some people to other people through the tax and benefit system, but how does that change incentives, and therefore how does it change labor supply? How might it change other charitable deductions if you change how much people get as a result of itemizing and reducing their tax liability for that? There's a whole bunch of behavioral responses that people have to these policies. And we now summarize the effects in a couple of those ways. One is around labor supply. So if your marginal tax rate changes, if it goes up, you're going to work less on average. The empirical evidence is pretty clear on that. And if you have more money, you'll also work a little bit less. So we let the user enter those elasticities. You can quantify the effect, the strength of those effects with these magnitudes called elasticities. And rather than us just saying, okay, here are our beliefs around those, you can adjust those parameters in the model. Now, there are some policies also that, for example, the Oregon rebate, we weren't sure how best to express that because the gross receipts tax is not something that we have in our model the same way that we do for individual labor supply effects. So we gave a couple of different options of how people could view those results. One was just assume that tax has no incidence. It's purely paid by effectively people out of the state who own the capital. Another is where it's just divvied up across the population, that tax, and according to their income. And then the third is, okay, assuming that it is divvied up, how is it going to change labor supply? So then we sort of incorporated those behavioral responses. At each step, that poverty impact is going to fall, but still we found that there would be substantial poverty reduction, even in the most extreme scenario. Now, I think what we didn't consider fully is the full-on growth effects. And this is where ideally we would summarize some sort of social welfare function, where you can say, here's what I value about how different members of society are coming out ahead and behind and what their consumption or wealth is, and then aggregate how that policy affects it. That's going to be a mix of those equity and efficiency trade-offs that's so common in economics. So that's sort of where we're hoping to go in the future.
Right. So you could kind of imagine that I am behind somewhat of a veil of ignorance about my future state, regardless of where I am right now. And policy can change that in unforeseen circumstances, like the housing crash can cause this. And, we understand this idea that people have decreasing marginal utility. Like most people would take a guarantee of $1 million over a 50% shot at 3 million, even though the latter is more in terms of expected dollars, because once you've gotten to a certain point of satiation of your preferences of what you want, each additional unit of wealth and consumption can only get you a smaller and smaller amount of additional, utility, as we call it, or just happiness, satisfaction. And it sounds like you're saying you could somehow incorporate that into the model so that we could look at something a little bit more holistic about how well off society is. And that seems to me a little more three-dimensional than something like the Gini coefficient or something, right? Because it's combining productivity and inequality.
Absolutely. I think part of what makes it more challenging, though, is people don't agree on what that social welfare function should be. So the extreme view, if you're totally risk averse and you're behind the veil of ignorance, would be the Rawlsian welfare function, the max-min. You're only caring about the worst member of society. And your entire social welfare is determined not by anyone else in the distribution, but only by who's worst off. And at the other end of the spectrum is more of a utilitarian view, where you can quantify their utility based on, as you said, consumption, income, or wealth. And you're maximizing the sum of all of that. Now, that could still be progressive because, as you said, you have diminishing marginal utility. So just giving all the money to the most productive person in society is probably not going to maximize social welfare function from a utilitarian perspective. But one area that we're not involved in directly, but does inspire us in this regard, is the study of identifying people's social welfare functions. So it's very hard to get someone to say, okay, what are your specific weights that determine, unless you're a pure utilitarian or a pure Rawlsian, most people are in between. But they don't just tell you, here are the weights I give to different members of society, but you can back it out based on their policy preferences. So there's a range of studies using inverse optimal taxation to figure out those weights. So one future vision we hope to aspire to is where we can help people identify what their values are and then suggest or put the policy arena in the perspective of those trade-offs that they have on their own.
I think one thing that's really interesting about Policy Engine is that it can allow policymakers to choose more optimal policy without having to understand these minutia, these terms. You've already said things like tax incidence, deadweight loss. These are not quantum physics level concepts, but they are counterintuitive. They are very specific. And most people, even who I think go considerably into public policy, and maybe they've had their Econ 101 class, but it's not really retained, or there's some lack of conceptual clarity there. And a very frustrating thing can be, like, for myself or other people who, Henry George, who've tried to win that argument by teaching concepts, it doesn't stick, right? It's very hard to, at scale, get a society more educated about economics at a very deep level. We tend to sort ourselves into tribes of whether we're progressives or we're libertarians or we're, Republicans, whatever. And I think there's a lot of potential here to say, I don't need you to understand all those low-level concepts. You're too busy. I'm going to show you outcomes, and you can pick what is you think is the better outcome given what you're trying to optimize for. Does that generally resonate with you? And is there an extent to where that may not be so satisfying? Like, would you like it to potentially also teach the concepts, or do you think that it can over time, as people interact more with the tool?
I think all of the above. I mean, this was partially inspired by when I was in grad school for economics. There was a lot of amazing empirical work being done to answer particular questions that do have significant policy relevance. How much do parents respond to the child tax credit in terms of how much they work, more or less? What are the health implications of extending supplemental security income, cash assistance for people with disabilities at a young age? How was the life expectancy effect of growing up in poverty? And at the same time, they would normally be based on specific changes that happen in society that are not going to be replicated usually. Even the child tax credit, there were amendments to it that were proposed by Kamala Harris. It wasn't the exact same thing as 2021. And of course, we were in a very different situation in 2025 compared to 2021. So what we wanted to do was help turn those insights into something that was more connected to the policymaking process. So what do those insights tell you about the effect of some new policy idea that you have on outcomes you care about? And, we have seen our users gain a lot of fluency in understanding those relationships just by using the tool and having rapid feedback. Normally, you would have to commission a think tank to do some study, and then you would get a few of the outcomes of interest based on the particular policies that you put forward. Or if you're lucky, right? If you're in Congress and you're on an important committee, you might be able to get the Congressional Budget Office to do a study like that. But if you're kind of a lower ranking person in an unrelated committee assignment and you have an idea, good luck. You probably, if you can't get a think tank to research it for you, you probably won't have that insight yourself. So by being able to say, okay, put in your idea, you get insights in about 1 minute, and you can adjust it and get insights in another minute. You can build intuition for, okay, this kind of policy parameter is going to have this kind of effect on poverty, this kind of effect on cliffs, this kind of effect on income inequality. And we've seen that ourselves. I mean, we're the biggest users of the tool, and I think it's made me a much more informed policy analyst. Now, the end goal would be to take the user out of, if they want to. There's no reason that the user should have to play around with all those knobs just to get the policy that they desire. If we can help elicit those preferences of policies at an individual level, we should be able to just have AI figure out, using the power of kind of our microsimulation models, experiment with thousands of different policy ideas and figure out which of them corresponds best to their own goals. And then we can argue more about the goals, which people have, rightfully different views on. What are people's values? What are the assumptions about how people respond to those policies? But the actual modeling and tweaking of the knobs, I think we can have technology remove those hurdles.
I think you just touched on something really central here to, I think, how you operate and how I try to think about a lot of economic issues, which is that people do disagree a lot about certain fundamental values. But I think what's missing from the traditional left versus right spectrum conversation is that there's so much sort of waste out there. There's just like money left on the table. There's like the free $20 bill on the sidewalk that if we can all just come to an agreement about it, we can actually salvage that value. And then we can defer the debate about how much wealth should we redistribute. And if you take an example of something like, say, where do we want to set the minimum wage, right? The neoclassical economic perspective is that if you increase the minimum wage, you're increasing deadweight loss or allocative efficiency, because let's suppose I'm only worth $10 an hour, like the actual value I can provide is only worth $10 an hour, but you raise the minimum wage to $12 an hour, now I'm unemployable. But the counter to that is, well, some people who actually were worth more than $10 an hour now get a boost from that. And their employer would have paid more were it not for the abundance of labor. And so you have to have these debates about what's the right trade-off between the income, the sort of inequality effects, and the allocational efficiency. But let's just say we take an example of something where the government gives someone an in-kind benefit that is worth less than what it costs. So the government spends $100 to give you, a shirt worth $70. There is now this $30, which represents what we call deadweight loss. And I know that sounds like economic jargon, but it has a very tangible impact when you're not getting what you could be getting for every tax dollar you have. So there's so much sort of nonpartisan room to play with there, where you could say, if we could just give out these benefits more efficiently, also including like administrative overhead, we could actually reduce the taxpayer burden and have a stronger social safety net. And I feel like that is so much missing from the conversation we have between the online, the social media wars between the Marxist and the, maybe libertarian or other school of thought. So what do you think about that area to play with there, of that sort of free money?
Yeah, there have been a lot of definitions of economics over the years. Probably my favorite is the science of choice. There's always trade-offs with these kinds of choices that people have to make. Economics is not only about public policy, but when individuals are just trying to optimize their own consumption across the ways and leisure, do I buy a car or do I, take a more chill job, that kind of thing. Those are all choices, and policymakers have a lot of different choices available to them, a lot of different ways to quantify the trade-offs. Even something like food stamps, there's probably some people who are worse off if you move from a food stamp system to a cash assistance program, even if you assume that there's no consumption of vices, for example, which the evidence largely finds that there isn't a lot of increased tobacco or alcohol consumption when you give people cash. But some studies find that there is some effect. But if you're the person working in the SNAP office who loses their job because now people just get cash in the mail, that is one person who could be worse off as a result of that policy. So I think there's always corner cases. What we hope we can provide is more of a holistic view. So you're saying, okay, yes, a few people are worse off, but according to the values that you've told us, right? The value in terms of poverty reduction, income inequality reduction, if people hold those values and assume certain responses of the economy to different policies, then yeah, there are some policies that are better than others. And you just have to debate what are the assumptions, what are the goals, and then we can actually, I think, improve policy alignment between values and objectives.
Yeah. I believe what you referred to there, the example of an administrator losing their job because you have a more efficient social safety net, which requires less human overhead. That would be a Caldor-Hicks efficient change to the economy, right? You're increasing overall productivity because you're eliminating a wasteful, unnecessary job. But now there's someone who is made worse off. So the goal would be that you want to pair that efficiency improvement with some sort of redistribution, to make up for the fact that that person, like you could essentially just pay them some amount of free money and then let them go get a job that is actually desirable and valuable in that market, so that they end up net ahead because now you've got extra room to sort of play with because you eliminated waste in that. Now that's easier said than done. That's conceptual, right? But if you could maybe talk about that. And then also, I know UBI, universal basic income, I don't love that term because it's really more of like a, universal lump sum payment on some periodicity. It's not necessarily basic. I believe basic was meant to refer to the idea that it meets your basic needs. You have a really fascinating history with UBI, and I'd love for you to cover some of that. I was particularly, as I was getting acquainted with your work and the last few years, I've been, really immersing myself in economics and learning more about all these concepts. But you make an interesting point in one of your articles, which is that if we can afford the current social safety net, then we can afford a UBI. So we shouldn't be having an argument about whether we can afford a UBI. It's just how much do we want to fund it? But we already spend all this money on this labyrinth of different social safety net programs that are actually very hard to navigate for beneficiaries. If you could speak more to that, and then I know your work with like the u.b.i Center And that might lead us back to kind of your transition from the private sector into public policy as well. So however you'd like to take that.
Well, yeah, starting from the beginning, the Kaldor-Hicks efficiency is juxtaposed against Pareto efficiency, where everyone is better off, right? And there's a temptation to prioritize Pareto efficiency, make sure that, if someone does lose their job because of some broad efficiency improvement, they're still better off in some way. That's, as you said, very hard to do, because maybe you could compensate the person who lost their job, but what about the person who is training to enter that job, who is getting their social work degree so that 2 years from now they would get a job that now no longer exists? Or just a person who is predisposed to want to do that job in the future and in some way where you cannot detect that you're making them worse off. So we do provide analytics that correspond to Pareto efficiency. We show people how much of the population is better and worse off in terms of higher or lower net income after the policy. I think there's a lot of people who have social welfare functions that are not purely about Pareto efficiency who can get caught up on Pareto efficiency and therefore leave opportunities on the table, like efficiency improvements to the safety net system. So we hope to put all of that in one place so you can say, okay, maybe 10% of the population is worse off. I'm willing to accept that for a 30% reduction in child poverty. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but we need to see both sides of the equation to make those trade-offs apparent. In terms of u.b.i, it's an interesting connection there, because it's very hard to make a u.b.i policy work in a Pareto efficient, Pareto optimal manner, where every single person is better off, because the existing system is so complex. So I started my career at Google. I was a data scientist there from 2010 to 2018. And being in the Valley and kind of exposed to some of these automation developments that are now culminating in Gen AI, there was a lot of conversation even in 2011, 2012 around u.b.i. And it seemed to me, as I looked more into the policy landscape around how programs like food stamps actually work, how subsidized housing works, that it was an interesting comparison of just giving people money, not having welfare cliffs, not having the risk of very high marginal tax rates for low-income people.
Can you just briefly give some context to this term welfare cliff? It sounds sort of intuitive. A lot of folks maybe have never heard of it.
Yeah. So a welfare cliff is a situation in which someone is worse off. They have less income after taxes and transfers when their earnings rise. So one example of this would be Medicaid, especially before the Affordable Care Act. If you earned above, it sort of depended what the state was, but if you earned above a certain percentage of the poverty line, you lose Medicaid entirely. And now you have to cover all of your health insurance costs yourself. So the ACA, in most cases, removed that cliff and replaced it with a phase out. So now you get a subsidy for your health insurance, and that subsidy declines as you earn more, but sort of a smooth shape. Now, that doesn't mean it removes the labor market distortion. When you face a welfare cliff, it's very clear. You want to stay below that threshold. And
that's bad for productivity. You're incentivizing people not to become more productive.
That's right. And part of this is personal to me. My brother has a spinal cord injury, and he lives in California. So he's in a situation where he receives Medicaid. And because of his Medicaid eligibility, he gets assistance with it's called in-home supportive services. So people who help him do really basic but necessary daily tasks. And if he were to pay this out of pocket, it would be tens of thousands of dollars a year. So we did some of the math on this when he was just graduating grad school and sort of thinking about what jobs to take. And it turned out after taxes and transfers, if he earned above about $70,000, that's the income limit for Medicaid for this kind of subset of the population in California, he would be worse off unless he earned at least about $150,000. In Policy Engine, we now call that informally the earnings dead zone. So you're your cliff is so severe at $70,000, you're losing so much, you have to earn an extra $80,000 just to get back to where you were in the first place. So this is really, I think, constrained the labor market opportunities of many people with disabilities. Low-income parents face welfare cliffs because they're more likely to receive benefit programs that have them, like Medicaid. But also food stamps in some states has a welfare cliff. SSI and SSDI have asset cliffs. So if you have above a certain amount of assets, you lose your entire benefit there.
And so, it sounds like this is it's not just bad incentives and bad in terms of the right people being at the right level of sort of the social safety net benefit to them based on kind of their overall need. But it's also very labyrinthine in terms of how do I navigate all these cliffs? And especially if I'm someone of lower economic means, maybe lower educational position, it's daunting, right? Like, how do I navigate all this? And I understand there are even like nonprofits where their whole goal is to help people navigate the benefits available to them. Whereas this approach with like just automatic cash that comes to you, essentially using the same information you would use to file your taxes, that just has this benefit that you don't have to think about it. It's just there. So I know we kind of got a little off course there. We were kind of working back to u.b.i, but there's a lot to kind of consider that is related, to the efficiency aspects.
Absolutely. I was a data scientist at Google. My brother had a master's in public policy from UC Berkeley, and still it took us hours and hours and hours to figure out this information of how much of a penalty is it to exceed the limits. So I thought a lot about the people who don't have that kind of education or interest in getting into those details, and how a lot of people probably are just playing it safe. They just really don't want to lose the assistance that they're receiving because they rely on it. And even if they could take a job, maybe they don't know about the specific cases, or the people who they accidentally go over and then they lose faith in the system for the rest of their life. And they tell everyone in their community, don't work more, right? And we have these poverty traps through the welfare cliffs that I worry could reinforce the narratives that some have of the poor, of them being lazy, when they're really kind of responding to the incentives that we would all respond to. So, and tax credits can solve it to some degree, but here in DC, we have two very significant tax credits that also have cliffs. We have a property tax credit, where if you earn above, I think it's about $60,000 a year, you lose over $1,000 if you pay rent or property tax. We have another childcare tax credit, one of our two childcare tax credits. And this also has about $1,000 cliff if you earn above $100,000 or so.
So as you hit that $100,000 mark, right as you get over it or at it, then you just lose $1,000 a year or something. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. And I don't think whoever introduced that, maybe they didn't even know. I don't think no one runs on this idea that we're going to limit, your benefits so you're worse off once you hit some level. But even if you phase it out, like the ACA does with health insurance, that still reduces your wages after taxes and transfers, right? And this is why one of the most powerful charts I think our users often find is a chart that shows what's called the marginal tax rate as you earn more. And the marginal tax rate is at any given income level, if you were to earn a little bit more, let's say $1,000 more, how much of that $1,000 do you lose because of taxes or withdrawn benefits? Mm-hmm. So the top marginal tax rate, if you look at the US code, the Internal Revenue Code is 37%. So that's what the highest income Americans pay. That is not the highest marginal tax rate in the US. The highest marginal tax rate is, it's infinity, because that's what you face when you face a welfare cliff. But even aside from the cliffs, take all those cliffs away, you often see between state taxes, tax credits phasing out, programs like food stamps phasing out, maybe if you have housing assistance, that's also starting to phase out. These programs don't have cliffs, but you're losing a little bit of them for every dollar you earn. And the demographics that are most likely to participate in those programs, people with disabilities, parents, especially of young children, they often face marginal tax rates 70, 80, 110, 130%, right? Because all these programs are phasing out in the same income range, mostly between roughly 100 and 200% of the poverty line. So it's a hard challenge to kind of unwind these scenarios where I think there is quite a bit of a delta between policymakers' goals and the policies that they've implemented.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people have this intuition that, you've got to have some sort of cutoff or phase out because you don't want some rich guy getting this universal basic income check. And it's like, well, as you said, I love this quote that welfare cliffs are a poor substitute for taxation. And the point is that if you could just increase your tax rates in tandem with introducing this UBI. And then what's going to happen is at a certain, your relative boost is going to taper off as you pay more in taxes until at a certain cutover threshold, you're paying more back in taxes than you're receiving with this UBI check. So the notion of receiving the UBI is sort of like conceptual. You're not technically getting the money because in net, you're paying back more than you're getting, but it allows you to keep this smooth, gradual, as you make more and more money, eventually you're no longer a recipient of the benefit. You're now paying into the system. But the whole way we tried to minimize that incentive for you not to work more, and I think that's, again, a simple concept once you explain it. But a lot of people just intuitively have this resistance to the idea that rich person is getting this universal basic income. No. So I understand that that's one maybe intuitive pushback against UBI. What was your goal with the UBI Center, or is it still going? Can you say a little more about what how that came about and how that led to where you're at now?
Yeah. So I started getting interested in this concept of UBI through a confluence of factors. One was, as I said, being in the Bay, learning about automation and UBI. LVT came up a fair amount too on these internal Google employee kind of listservs.
If you could unpack the acronyms for us.
Yeah, land value tax. So this is the idea introduced by Henry George in the 1800s through a book called Progress on Poverty. And as you said, the theory behind land value tax is there's actually no deadweight loss because you can't change the supply of land in response to taxation. And in some sense, Alaska actually has only UBI in the US. It's called the permanent fund dividend. And that's the product of the oil reserves that they have. They put all those assets into a fund, diversified it, and every year, based on the return of that fund, they rebate a share of it equally to all residents. It's kind of like a tax. They own the resources, they own the oil, and they distribute that to everyone. That could happen in other parts of society too.
Right. And
so I'm getting off track, but
yeah. And Idaho also has the grocery credit, which is sort of like a UBI because technically you don't have to spend it on groceries. Or
Idaho has probably the second closest thing. It's called the grocery tax credit of $100 per person. There's no income limit, but if you received food stamps, you're not eligible for the program. So it's not quite universal.
Oh, okay.
And then, so around 2012, also my brother was getting into the labor force. I was thinking about the welfare cliffs through disability policy. And also I was introduced to a nonprofit called Give Directly. So google.org made a sizable grant to Give Directly in 2012, which enabled them to expand their operations. That's a nonprofit that supports people in the world that they can easily reach, mostly with mobile money technology. So at the time, they were only focused on folks in Kenya. Kenya has very high mobile money penetration, more cell phones than power outlets kind of thing, or people with access to power. They could easily find the people who had no access to quality roofs, and they would just give them $1,000. And they did it mostly with randomized control trials, so they could see what the effect of that money was. And it was quite positive. It improved nutrition, especially among kids, educational outcomes, it even increased earnings because many of these people are sort of entrepreneurs, so it acted as seed capital. So I was pretty inspired by their work. I started volunteering on some data science projects with them, had them come to Google to give a number of talks. And at a certain point, I decided I really wanted to get more into this space of simulating the effect of policies I found an open source model based on at the American Enterprise Institute that enabled that kind of micro simulation for that anyone could do. So I started playing around with that, took a leave from Google to do it more full time, and then decided to leave Google to start a think tank dedicated to researching cash assistance policies through this micro simulation framework, where we are applying the same level of rigor that you have for other kind of tax policies and just putting UBI and related policies through that same ringer. So around that time, I also entered a master's program at MIT for economics. So that's really where all this started, to the point around means testing being a poor substitute for taxation. I think when I shared that quote, there may be some people who think that optimal tax policy involves a much higher marginal tax rate among low-income parents than the richest Americans. I suspect it's a pretty small share of the public. It's not what the economic theory usually suggests as optimal taxation. So what I worry about when it comes to means testing is that it's a way to obscure what the real policy is. When you're reducing a benefit in some income range, people don't think of that as a tax, but it acts the same way as a tax. And I think the public policy community doesn't always think of benefits and taxation as part of the same conversation. From the beginning, really inspired by the u.b.i Center, our mission to add evidence to the u.b.i debate, we always put those together. We always showed benefits and taxes, and we continue to do that at Policy Engine. It's one of the distinguishing features. We include as many benefit programs as we can because it really affects people's living standards, it affects their work incentives, and it affects how we choose to design policy.
Yeah, you referenced Give Directly. That is part of the broader effective altruism movement, as I understand it, including like Give Well. I guess probably Give Well is like a charity, sort of like a charity navigator of effective altruism charities. Yeah. Could you just briefly give your understanding of what effective altruism means and how it dovetails with the work you're doing, how your work fits into their rubric for how to think about giving and doing good?
Yeah. Effective altruism, I also really got into through Give Directly. It's a community of people who are trying to do the most good with the resources available as possible and applying rigorous analytics to sort of understand that. So the fact that Give Directly had randomized trials to estimate the impact of those cash transfers was really the baseline setting. The first idea of EA was if you can't outperform just giving people money with whatever you're doing, you should probably find something else to do with your philanthropic or charity resources. So thankfully, they did find other opportunities to do even more good. And it was through this organization called GiveWell, which is the biggest charity evaluator in the EA space. They have a huge spreadsheet that does all the math on Give Directly cash transfers, malaria bed nets, vitamin A supplementation, deworming, all these kind of interventions in the global health and development space that are aimed at improving lives or averting deaths, and says which is the most effective. After they run the math, they find that it's changed over the years in terms of the opportunities, the research, but roughly they find that malaria bed nets are some of the most effective, 5 to 10x as effective as cash transfers. And I think what we view our role is kind of like the GiveWell for public policy, where there are lots of different ways to quantify the impact of policy, and we're building epistemic tools so that people can just understand what those impacts are. We haven't yet gotten, I think, as far we'd like to as GiveWell in terms of, again, it sort of comes down to what your own values are. GiveWell actually has a part of their spreadsheet where you say, here's how much value I place on averting the death of a child compared to lifting someone out of poverty for a year, that kind of thing. So I think as we get there, we'll be even more aligned in terms of identifying opportunities to do more good with the policy avenues you have available.
Yeah, well, and you're well on your way. I understand you've had a really banner 2024 year in terms of some donations you received that are going to help you on your mission. We'll get to the lightning round quickly, but if you want to say a word about any of that and what your plans are.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I have to credit our biggest funders to date, which are the Nuffield Foundation in the UK, sort of funded a significant expansion of our model in terms of the accessibility, the comprehensiveness of the model, adding more childcare subsidies, for example, to it, but also redesigning it from scratch, thinking about how we can use AI to answer these questions. Not just in terms of exploring lots of different policies, but what if you could just ask our tool, how much would it cut child poverty to increase the UK's child benefit by 2x, right? We should be able to just answer that question using our underlying model. And one of the things I'm really excited about that they funded is the ability to dig in not just to national impacts, but every local area. So every parliamentary constituency, every local authority, we're going to be able to have customized impact evaluations for those policies on the poverty rates and other kind of outcomes at that local level. In the US, we have three big funders as well. So one is the Arnold Ventures philanthropy, which has supported our work to add behavioral responses, these labor supply responses to our model. We completed that last year. And now we're sort of wrapping up a project with them to calculate the trade-offs between the state and local tax deduction and the alternative minimum tax. Probably don't have time to get into the details of that right now, but I think this will be a quite policy relevant research area as we're gearing up for the probably renewal of the Trump tax cuts. And then Neo Philanthropy is an organization that just gives unrestricted support to high impact organizations. And their economic mobility team sort of gave us a significant grant. The last one is called My Friend Ben, and they're a group that builds software to help people navigate that benefit system. Taxes and benefits. So they use our API on the back end, and we're really thrilled to be supporting their work as they expand to more states across the country.
That's really great to hear. Well, with all that said, I think now is time for we have a few minutes left. I'll just do a little lightning round here and maybe just take a minute or two to just kind of ideate around some of these ideas here. First of all, you have introduced me to a different way of thinking about this classic debate about flat versus progressive taxes. And really, it hinges on this distinction between marginal tax rates and effective tax rates. Can you just say a word about that concept or debate?
Sure. So marginal tax rates, well, the average tax rate is probably simpler, probably more widely applied. It's based on how much you earn, what share of that do you pay in taxes? So if you're paying that 37% top rate because you're making $1 million, you're not actually paying 37% of your income in tax because a lot of your income is taxed out at a lower rate. But the 37% is a marginal tax rate. So every extra dollar from $1 million to $1,000,001, that is where you're paying 37 cents. Now, when it comes to flat versus progressive taxation, we have a core tax structure, which is progressive. So that's going from that 0% as you're below the standard deduction up to 37%.
I believe you said we have the most progressive tax system.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Yes. I forgot that context. So yeah, at the u.b.i Center, I did a study with Nate Golden, where we looked at how a flat income tax could actually produce more progressive outcomes. So the US, you're right, has the most progressive core tax structure, but you measure that in terms of what share, for example, of the tax is paid by the top 1% or 10%. Now, if you have less revenue collected total, that means that's less revenue you have available to distribute across society. So another way to estimate the progressiveness of a system is how much it reduces income inequality between how much people get from the market and how much they get after taxes and transfers. And that's where the US is pretty close to the bottom, actually. Among OECD countries, the US doesn't redistribute as much. For example, countries in Europe, they have pretty flat taxes, including a VAT, and
marginal
that gives them a lot of
rates.
revenue. Sorry?
flat marginal tax rates.
Yes, relatively flat marginal rates.
I think the issue here is that most people don't understand that difference, and they don't think about that when they debate about progressive versus flat. They think flat tax is some sort of rich guy's dream.
Yeah.
And there's more to the story, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, and this is where magnitudes matter. It's not just about the shape of it. It's about how much are you raising overall. And critically, I think, for our work, it's when you're thinking of average tax rates, usually you're ignoring transfers. And for poverty reduction, income inequality reduction, transfers are a huge part of the story. And where flat taxes, you could design the flat tax that raises enough revenue to be more progressive as a result of the transfers it facilitates.
Got it. So you combine a flat marginal tax rate with, say, some lump sum payment to everyone or some social safety net format.
Yeah.
And in aggregate, even if you're all paying the same rate on each additional dollar you earn, you could still end up having a lower effective tax rate because you've also received back this subsidy, which is effectively cutting your tax burden. So the all-in tax rate is not flat, but each additional marginal unit of wealth you earn is taxed at a flat rate. And so you combine those and you get the effective tax rate, which is useful to differentiate.
Yeah, although I would say at Policy Engine, we avoid the term effective or average tax rate because it muddies the waters when it comes to transfers and how they're counted. So we really just focus on what's the marginal tax rate schedule. And I've heard also marginal earnings reduction, I think, schedule, some groups have said. So that's basically inclusive of benefit withdrawal. What's the incentive you face? And then how much redistribution is happening as a result of, that'll be like income inequality.
All right. And then a couple other quick ones here. What's something memorable or notable that you've changed your mind about? Particularly in your field, I guess, would be most pertinent. But
so this is my personal perspective, not speaking on behalf of Policy Engine, of course. But sure. I thought the EITC could be the earned income tax credit, which gives money to low-income workers. I thought this could be an avenue to u.b.i. And I think I didn't quite appreciate as much. And as I've gotten more into state-level policy analysis, that there's quite a bit of attachment to the brand of EITC. And for example, here in DC, we have, I think, 80% match of the federal EITC. So tons of money going to this, very small amount going to tax credits that reach the poorest kids. EITC, by definition, you have to have earnings to qualify. So the poorest kids are ineligible. And so I think that earned income in the brand is pretty hard to turn into something that's more universal and inclusive.
Yeah. Okay. And then who were the most influential thinkers or authors who shaped, your particular perspective on economic policy?
I think Henry George continues to be up there for me. The book Progress and Poverty really changed not just how I thought about land, which is the focus of the book, the idea that land value tax can be an efficient way to address inequality and sort of curtail drags on growth. But also it's a baseline. I think it's helpful for the same reason that u.b.i is helpful. It's a simple idea that forces you to think about the complexity of all the alternatives, right? u.b.i is very simple. It's why we had to build all of Policy Engine to get to the point where we could start to model u.b.i, is because everything else is so complicated. You have to model all the alternatives to identify what the advantages and disadvantages are of u.b.i. And I think Henry George did a great job of summarizing those kind of trade-offs when it came to taxation and how land is a different beast.
And so his classic book is Progress and Poverty. He's associated with land value taxes chiefly, but also I believe there's some support for universal basic income or some other policies that fit in that general.
It's mostly about land value tax, but he does talk a little bit about what to do with the revenue. And at that point, he alludes to the fact that sharing it equally, which is an idea that really traces back to the beginning of u.b.i. Also in the 1700s or even earlier, Thomas Paine would suggest that it would come from the land as well. So this idea of the land belongs to all of us, we should have an equal stake in it. It's a very compelling philosophical underpinning in my view.
Okay. And last question, then we'll get some contact information. I remember reading a few years back, they asked an economist, what's like one concept that you wish more people understood? And he said tax incidence. And that's this idea that, whether you make the seller or buyer pay a tax or receive a subsidy like an EV credit when you buy an electric vehicle, it doesn't change the economics from either party's point of view. It doesn't really change what the effective all-in price is for either party. It's a little counterintuitive, but it turns out not to matter. As you've delved into all the policy behind your simulator, are there any policies or any concepts from economics that just jump up and you wish more elected officials or voters just understood this one concept and it would unlock so much value?
Probably thinking on the margin. It's a concept that's core to economics in many respects. The idea that you're usually not starting from zero. If you're making a change, people are going to start from where they are and then figure out, okay, what are the sort of small behavioral changes I can make that are within my scope of opportunities, and what are the effects and incentives I am now facing as a result of that change to go in each of those directions. And this comes up, we've talked about marginal tax rates a lot today, and I think it continues to be some of the most powerful chart that we show is just what those marginal tax rates are, what the marginal incentives are to work more, work less, and do we want a society that that rewards work at different levels or not?
Great. Well, this has been highly informative. I hope we can do more of these, maybe dive into some specific topical issues. In the meantime, where can people find you who want to follow your work or interact?
Yeah, so you can find, I'm at maxghenis.com. All my socials are maxghenis, MAXGHENIS. And if you want to follow Policy Engine as well, we're policyengine.org, either Policy Engine or the Policy Engine on Twitter, for example. And we have some country-specific handles as well, like Policy Engine US. So, but we're on all the places you can find us. So we look forward to, and this has been, as an open source project, we're really trying to democratize this work. So we really do welcome you to try out the tool. If you have questions or stuff on your wish list for what would make policy analysis more accessible to you, we'd love to hear about it. So do get in touch. And thank you again, Clay, for this opportunity.
Yeah, it's been great, Max. Until next time. Cheers.
Sounds good. Cheers.